Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to talk about my presentation about our discovery of the vulnerability deemed as CVE 2024-22076. Let's start with a small introduction. My name is Wesselink. I've been working for X42 for a bit more over 4 years. And I actually started as a defensive consultant over at the Managed Services Department, and later on transitioned into pen testing, and now I'm the lead pen tester at X42. Before I get into the vulnerability, I want to give credits to my colleague. We did the assessment together, and we discovered the vulnerability together. So, big shout out to Edwin Siebel. Unfortunately, he isn't here because some people got to work on Thursday. So let's dive into the number. The number you see, the CVE, that's actually a global standard for vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities, and it's managed by MITRE. MITRE is the American organization who administers the database of known vulnerabilities, and they're also responsible for classifying the vulnerabilities. Fun fact, they actually had a difficult moment last year, because the government wanted to cut the funding, but they managed to stay up and prolong the contract for another year. And now they're planning to go non-profit to stay up indefinitely. So, about our vulnerability. As you can see in the bottom, our vulnerability is scaled as a 9.8 on a scale from 1 to 10. So, you might imagine it is very critical. Let's go over the agenda. I will first begin with a small walkthrough of the vulnerability, just so you guys know what I'm actually talking about and why it is scaled this high. Then we move on to the timeline. I'm going to explain the process from actually discovering the vulnerability all the way up until the responsible disclosure. And then we go over the mitigation from the vendor itself and the key takeaways, the lessons learned from this whole process. So first, it started at a Monday morning back in November 2023. New week, new assessment, together with my colleague. It was a relatively simple assessment. It was a black box assessment, meaning we did not have any credentials or any prior knowledge. All we got was 2 external IP ranges, so not a lot to go off on. We started, of course, with a scan to look what services we can discover and find, and one of which in particular stood out because there's a web server running on port 8090. That's kind of strange because normally web servers run on port 8443. Also, if you think about all normal websites, Google, Facebook, but this one stood out. So we typed the IP address and the port into the browser, and we got greeted with a printing portal, administrative printer portal, from MyQ. And the nice thing they did, I love it when vendors do this, they have actually the version number and the patch number underneath the login. So it saves us a lot of time enumerating the version, because first thing we do is look up the version number and see if there are any known vulnerability we might be able to abuse. In this case, the service was up to date, so we didn't have any known vulnerabilities we could exploit, so we got to dig deeper. Another thing we also do is we take the documentation and we look up the default credentials. Most of the times it's admin, but they went the creative route and they put an asterisk admin and the password 1234. It's very weak, and also for that reason, they have a big notice. We strongly recommend you to change the password immediately after installation. Well, the client did not do that. So we were able to authenticate with the default administrative credentials, and we got into the actual printer dashboard. And as you can see, it was a production, so it was widely used. As you can see, last 24 hours, over 1,000 prints. But more interesting was the number of users. 311 users. One thing we would like to do when we gain access to either a system, software, or anything, we would like to get persistence. Just so, in this case, if they would change the admin credentials, we would still have access to the dashboard. So we tried it. As you can see, we created our own user. We made him an admin, and we tried to set a password. But as you can see in the top, there was an error. Cannot set the password because LDAP authentication is in use. And that's actually good news, because it's a clear indication that this service is communicating with their internal Active Directory, which gave us a lot of interesting attack vectors, one of which was taking over the authentication server. The normal process goes like this. The client, the user tries to print something. They will set up a printer job. The authentication server will trigger. The user will authenticate to the server, and server would say back to the print service, yeah, this user is valid, and he or she is able to print something at this location. So as you can imagine, we set in our own authentication server, which means that the printing was not usable for the users. So there was a minor disruption. That's why we're very careful testing in production environment, and we would rather stay in any acceptance environment. And as you can see in the bottom, there's a nice test button, and we actually disabled the security, which gave us a nice way in, because we were able to capture the clear text password of the service account. And that's great, because we now have a domain account. We have a clear text password. It's essentially our way into the internal network. And furthermore, just to prove impact to the client, we also captured some encrypted password hashes from users actually trying to print something. I think we set up the authentication server for 10 minutes before we reverted, and 2 users actually tried to print in those 10 minutes, so we obtained the password hashes. And in this case, it was, impact was not that high because, of course, the passwords were encrypted, they were strong, and the users were low privileged. But it might happen with some luck, you get a domain admin credential here, and the password is weak, you might be able to crack it and get into the domain. Moving on, when we have credentials, we would like to try out those credentials. This was a service account, so it did not have a mailbox set up, it did not have access to SharePoint or any other internal resources, but we were able to authenticate to Office, and we just tried it because we wanted to know if they were enforcing multi-factor authentication, which they did not. And this shows the importance, because if the account was overprivileged or more important, the impact would be way higher. We would get access to a mailbox, maybe even into the network if you're in the IT department. But we showed the impact this way. Furthermore, we wanted to go back to the server because we would like to compromise the server to show actual impact, because one of the biggest mistakes was leaving the server exposed to the internet. As you can imagine, if you want to print something, you are probably at the office trying to print something at the office. So it should not be open for anyone to discover and attack. So we moved on into the settings, and deep in the settings we found a function, the job parser. And the job parser, essentially what it does, it pre-processes anything before the actual print job gets sent to the printer. Think about alerts or some other rules that might be applicable here. But one thing stood out for us is it enabled PHP scripting. And PHP scripting could be very dangerous because there are some functions in PHP which allows you to communicate with the underlying operating system. So in that case, you would be able to run commands on the server. So we enabled it, and we got into the settings. We found the input field, We first tried some small commands with no impact. The thing is, there's no output field. We could not see any output from the command. So how did we discover the command actually got executed? We tried a curl command, and what curl does, essentially it instructs the server to make a request to a web server. And if it does it to our web server, we can see the request coming in, and we know the code has been executed. So in this case, we really wanted to see under which privileges we are running this web server and which user we are. So we used the system feature from PHP to inject the OS command. Then we started with who am I? Simple command just showing you which user you are and under which privileges you run the service. And we piped it into the curl command, like I just said, onto one of our own URLs with a post request, meaning that if it would execute, the web server would post the output data onto our web server, which is displayed in the right side. Some people might notice the screen. It's a collaborator from Burp Suite Professional. And it's great because you can generate a URL like you see here, very random, and it will be publicly accessible for everybody to see. So no matter your firewall rules or where the server is coming from, if anything happens, you will see it. And so that happened. You see here all the information about the user, but most important is in the top, highlighted in red. It was actually running as anti-authority, which is the highest obtainable privilege in Windows. So essentially this means we fully compromised the machine, and we were able to go further, maybe get a shell, maybe get more passwords, maybe there are cached credentials on the server. But at this point, we made our point. We proved we compromised the whole server. And also mind that using the server, you could actually pivot from the server to obtain access to the internal infrastructure. In correlation with the account that we had, you could do a lot of damage just enumerating internally and maybe even escalate privileges and deploy ransomware from a fully remote perspective, which is very severe. But so we moved on and we thought, okay, it's probably time to inform the client about this. It's very critical. Why is it so critical? Because like I said, the service is exposed. Everybody could exploit this. There were default credentials, very weak and easy door open for attackers and adversaries. And also the ability to use PHP to actually compromise the whole system. So we informed the client, we gave him a call. He took it very seriously and he immediately took action. He took the server offline, or at least not publicly accessible anymore. And they looked at the logs to see if it was exploited before. And in this case, they were very lucky because we were actually the first one authenticating with the default credentials after the deployment. So, going on where we left off, we contacted the client about this vulnerability. Then it was time to contact the vendor, in this case MyQ, because it is a real vulnerability. We would like to share it with the world so people know, so it can be fixed, and people will update their systems. It was very nice because they had a nice little section on their website showing how to actually submit a responsible disclosure and how to go about it. So we wrote a nice little report with the steps to reproduce, all the prerequisites, and some suggestions for mitigation. And we got a response on the same day. They said, okay, nice, we would like to have some time to read the report and see if it's an actual vulnerability. So we gave them some time, and 3 weeks later, they came back to us. And this was nice for us to know, because they acknowledged, okay, the purpose of PHP scripting is to work with a few selected services, objects, or methods. And it was never intended to run or access system commands. So we actually know now that it was not intended, and usually a vulnerability has to be something that's not intended. So they acknowledged it, and which gave us some grip on the next step, which was contacting MITRE. As I said in the beginning, they go over the database of known vulnerabilities, and we would like it to get it globally acknowledged. So we sent our report to them. We sent the acknowledgement from the vendor. They even went in contact with the vendor. And after some back and forth mailing, we actually got the word out, okay, this is your CVE number, and it will be published in a few hours. And the important thing here is to mention that they let the world know that there's a vulnerability, but the description is very high over. So people would not be able to exploit the vulnerability just because they know there is a vulnerability. That's why MyQ, the vendor, actually got some time to fix the vulnerability, make a patch for it. I will later go over the mitigated rules they took to actually fix it. But now it was publicly, and people knew there was a vulnerability. And a month later, we were able to publicly disclose the vulnerability because we gave all the users enough time to update their system and get rid of the vulnerability. And you may wonder, why would you want to write a blog about a vulnerability? Wouldn't you be helping the attackers? That's true, but in the world of penetration testing, it's very important to keep sharing your knowledge and to help each other. Only that way, the white hat hackers, the legit penetration testers, will be able to find those vulnerabilities before the adversaries do. So, at the time, back in 2023 and the beginning of 2024, we looked at, is this a larger problem? We searched some results on Shodan. We looked for the string MyQ print server, and back at the time there were around 60, 70 exposed printer interfaces on the internet. I'm a curious person, so I might have looked into a few of them, and I can say most of them were outdated. Some of them even had default credentials. For comparison, we looked at it a few days ago. We did the same query, and we saw there's a slight decline in use. There are almost 40 active MyQ print servers exposed today. Interesting to see. It's mostly used in the Netherlands because 7 of them are hosted in the Netherlands. And then we come to the mitigation. MyQ took it very seriously. They had a beautiful written out program how to disclose the vulnerability. They are very transparent in their communication. We even talked to some developers on suggestions what they could do. And they actually took some of our advice and added a bit on top. Because what they did, the first measure was actually making it very hard to enable the job parser. Because when we found this vulnerability, the job parser was already enabled, but you're in with an admin account, so if it's not enabled, you could enable it yourself. And now they make it so that the job parser, if you want to use it, you have to enable it during the deployment in the configuration files. So it's not possible to deploy it from, to enable it from the interface anymore. Another measure, as they said, it should never run OS commands. They also put a filter on the PHP scripting engine, which disallows and rejects all features that would be able to communicate with the web server. So in my eyes, they did a great job. They worked very fast. In a month, they had the patch ready, and they were good to go. So, yeah, well done, MyQ. Then we'll end off with a few key takeaways from this whole process, the lessons learned. One of the big things I think there's not a lot of emphasis on is don't put blind trust in your vendors. We are so dependent on software, hardware, applications from third parties. that we often overlook the fact that we don't know if they are having any attention for security. Are they doing annual pen tests? Are they having a bug bounty program? It's difficult to know. So that's why we would advise you to use layered defense. If you've been to the previous talk here from Stefan, you would know all about this subject. But in short, make it so you don't have a single point of failure. You may say, okay, my print server is behind the firewall. I don't care about default credentials or anything else. Well, that's not the case, because in the real world, attackers have a lot of time and they are creative. They might find a way around the firewall and be able to exploit it that way. So always have multiple layers and minimize your attack surface. Really look at your company and look at your exposed surfaces and ask yourself the question, do we need to expose the surfaces for the world? And in most cases, it's a no. Also, going over to the cloud, it mitigates the risk because you're not hosting it yourself. But always make sure to keep it as minimal as possible. Another one, your last layer of defense, is multi-factor authentication. As I showed the impact, we were just being able to authenticate with the username and password. Sure, it's a hassle. It takes 10 seconds before you're actually being able to authenticate, but it's worth it security-wise. So, yeah. Another one is keep your systems up to date. I would recommend keeping up a schedule and just doing it periodically. And also look out for emergency patches. If a large vulnerability gets discovered in any software or something, I really hope the vendor would contact you about this vulnerability and you need to patch it as soon as possible. But in some cases, you're better off just looking at the news yourself and just seeing whether or not there's a vulnerability or not. So make sure it's always up to date. And also, very overlooked, a responsible disclosure program. We were very glad with MyQ because they had it. And in some cases, it's even worth it to consider to put out a bug bounty where you pay legitimate security researchers if they find a vulnerability. And it may sound stupid because you're paying someone to do something. It costs money, of course. But oftentimes, if they find it, it's way cheaper than if an adversary would find it and exploit it or sell the exploit on the dark market. So in most cases, you're better off just doing your pen test and regular security testing. One of the most known issues, change any default credentials. We see it way too often over at client sites, especially internally because people don't really care about it. But as you can see, you may gain access to an internal network just by compromising some sort of exposed printer interface or something like that. So it's very dangerous, and we should watch out for the adversaries. And I would like to thank you all for your attention and for joining me on this journey. Also, again, credits to Edwin. He's a web expert. He helped me a lot with this, explaining the vulnerability and actually exploiting it. Yeah, thank you for your attention. Are there any more questions from the audience? You, sir, go ahead. Sorry, can you repeat it one more time? I didn't hear you.
Customer.
Oh, there's a mic.
Did MyQ force the customer to change the default credentials when using it?
Very good point. They did not that I know of. It's usually in newer software. They require you to change the credentials after the first login, and as it should. But in the older software, I think MyQ is from beginning 2000. All those software mostly use default credentials, and they don't require. They just think it's your concern. You're using the software, make sure it's secure. But good suggestion. I would say MyQ should do it as well. You, sir?
This was the timeline for this particular item. However, what does a typical timeline look like? Is it longer, shorter?
I got to be honest, this is the first and the only one I did. So I don't have experience in practice, but I know from other people that it may take longer if the vendor is slower. It essentially all depends on the vendor because you don't want to disclose the vulnerability before they had the patch and actually given the users time to update their systems. But it might take longer if the development team is a bit lazy and in some cases they don't even take it seriously. If you submit the report, you explain the vulnerability, they may say, we accept the risk, it's not that severe. So it mostly depends on the vendor, to be honest.
Any other questions? Then you get a round of applause, I guess.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well done. Okay, this is a brilliant opportunity. At 2 o'clock, we've got a talk, and it serves two purposes. One, to inform you about things the Dutch police does. Two, for the non-Dutch speakers to be able to learn Dutch, because it's going to be in Dutch. So it's definitely worthwhile to stay around. But don't be angry if Barend talks Dutch. He can talk English, but for this, there are a couple of reasons why he chose to do this in Dutch, just that you know. And job well done.
Thank you.